His daughter hadn't heard from him in 4 months. No argument, no falling out, no dramatic last phone call. Gerald just stopped picking up, stopped responding to texts, stopped showing up at family dinners. And when she finally drove to his house and knocked on the door, he answered, looked perfectly fine, and said, almost calmly, "I just need to be left alone for a while." She stood there completely blindsided, because this wasn't the distant father she'd grown up with. This was the man who coached her softball team, who cried at her wedding, who called every Sunday for 20 years. And now, at 68, it was like someone had slowly dimmed a switch inside him, and he was choosing, deliberately choosing, to disappear. Here's the thing, Gerald isn't unusual. He's actually part of a pattern that psychologists have been quietly tracking for decades, and most people, including the families going through it, have no idea what's really happening beneath the surface. I'm glad you're here at PsyCraft Daily, where we break down the hidden mechanics of human behavior. This one is going to challenge some assumptions you might not even know you're carrying. So, let's start where most conversations about this topic never go. Not with the behavior itself, but with what's building underneath it for years before anyone notices. Think about what a man's identity looks like at 45 or 50. He's probably defined by what he produces, his job title, his paycheck, his ability to fix things, lead things, provide things. Even his relationships are filtered through this lens. He's the dad who shows up, the husband who handles it, the friend who has the answers. His sense of self is almost entirely external. It lives outside of him, in the roles he plays. And then retirement hits, or the kids leave home, or both happen at roughly the same time, and suddenly, all those external structures that told him who he was, they're gone. And he's left standing in a quiet house thinking, if I'm not doing any of that anymore, who exactly am I? That's not a small question. That's an identity earthquake, and here's what most people miss. Men, especially men from the generation that's now in their 60s and 70s, were almost never taught how to sit with that question. They were taught to build, to move, to solve. Sitting in existential uncertainty wasn't in the manual. So when it arrives, the psychological pressure it creates is immense. And one way the mind responds to pressure, it doesn't know how to process, it retreats. Now, I want to give you a framework. 3 distinct psychological forces that often collide in a man's late 60s and produce what looks, from the outside, like cold withdrawal. Understanding these separately is important because they each need a different response. Force 1, the accumulated weight of suppressed emotion. You probably know someone like Raymond, quiet guy, dependable, never complained, never made a fuss. If you asked him how he was doing, he'd say fine and mean it, or at least he believed he meant it. Men of his generation were often raised in households where emotional expression was a luxury you didn't indulge in. You buried it. You kept moving. What psychology tells us is that suppressed emotion doesn't disappear. It compresses. Like sediment layering at the bottom of a river. You don't see it, but it's accumulating. And for decades, a man like Raymond does exactly that. He buries the grief from losing his father young, the resentment from a career that never quite became what he imagined, the loneliness of a marriage where both people were ships passing in the night, each one assuming the other was doing fine. By the time he's 65, that sediment is enormous, and ironically, now that he finally has the time and stillness to feel it, it terrifies him. So, he distances himself, because being around people means being seen, and being seen means someone might notice the cracks, and if someone notices the cracks, he might have to talk about what's underneath them, and that is the thing he's been avoiding his entire adult life. Think about this. The isolation isn't rejection of the people around him. It's protection from the part of himself he doesn't know how to face yet. Force 2. The shifting power dynamic. Let me show you how this actually works in real relationships, because it's subtle and most families completely misread it. For 35, 40 years, a man has occupied a certain role in his family's system. He was the one people came to, the one who made the decisions, or at least weighed in on them. Maybe he controlled the finances, maybe he was the emotional anchor, the steady one. Either way, he had gravity. People orbited around him. Then his kids grow up. They have their own incomes, their own families, their own convictions. They stop asking for advice and start offering it. And the advice they offer is often well-meaning, but to him, it registers as something else entirely. It registers as being managed, being handled, being treated like someone who needs assistance rather than someone who gives it. There's a man I want you to picture. Let's call him Warren. Spent 30 years running a logistics company. Sharp, decisive, used to being respected in rooms. His son-in-law, a well-intentioned guy, starts sending him articles about retirement planning. His daughter starts suggesting he talk to someone. His wife starts checking in on him, with a tone that sounds less like a partner and more like a caretaker. Warren doesn't have the language to say, "I feel like I'm being stripped of my dignity." So instead, he stops coming to Sunday dinners. He stops answering the phone as often. He builds a wall, not because he doesn't love these people, but because the dynamic of their interactions has started to feel like erosion. And here's where it gets interesting. This reaction, what psychologists sometimes call status threat response, is hardwired. Research in social psychology consistently shows that perceived loss of status triggers some of the same neurological alarm signals as physical threat. Warren isn't being irrational. His nervous system is responding to something genuinely felt. So what do you do if you're in Warren's family? You stop giving advice he didn't ask for. You start asking for his, even if you don't need it. You rebuild the dynamic so that he feels like a contributor, not a project. Force. 3. The reckoning with time. This one is the quietest force, but possibly the most powerful. Around 60 to 65, something shifts in how a person experiences time. When you're 40, time still feels theoretical. You have more of it than you've used. But in your 60s, especially after a health scare or after watching a peer die younger than expected, time becomes viscerally real. The runway shortens. And suddenly the question isn't, what do I have time to do? But what do I actually want to spend my remaining energy on? And the answer, for some men, is uncomfortable. Because when they look honestly at their social circle, they realize a lot of those relationships are maintained out of obligation, not genuine nourishment. The neighbor they have known for 20 years but have nothing real to say to. The old work friends who only talk about the past. The extended family gatherings that leave him exhausted and empty. So, he starts editing. Quietly, sometimes abruptly, he starts pulling back from the things and people that feel hollow. This isn't depression necessarily. Sometimes it's actually clarity. A kind of psychological pruning that comes with facing mortality. The problem, he rarely explains it. He just disappears. And the people left behind have no framework for what happened, so they fill the silence with their own stories. He's angry, he's mentally ill, he doesn't care about us anymore. Now, let's talk about something that ties all three of these forces together. And it's something most people never consider. Loneliness in older men is one of the most underreported and misunderstood phenomena in modern mental health. Here's the irony that should stop you cold. Men who isolate are often the most lonely. They're not thriving in the silence. They're drowning in it. But the same conditioning that taught them to suppress emotion also taught them that admitting loneliness is weakness. So they stay in the isolation, even as it compounds. Studies on male loneliness in older populations show that men over 65 consistently underreport feelings of isolation, even on anonymous surveys. Their sense of identity is so fused with being self-sufficient that even acknowledging the need for connection feels like a kind of failure. So you end up with this devastating loop. He isolates because connection feels threatening or hollow. Isolation increases his emotional pain. Emotional pain makes connection feel even harder. And around it goes. Let that sink in for a second. The behavior that looks like, "I don't need anyone," is often the behavior of someone who desperately needs connection, but doesn't know how to ask for it without feeling like they're dismantling the image they've spent a lifetime constructing. Now, if you're watching this because there's a man in your life, a father, a grandfather, a husband, who's pulling away, I want to speak directly to you for a moment. The instinct when someone withdraws is to chase, to call more, to show up more, to ask what's wrong until they finally answer. And I understand that instinct completely. But here's the truth. For a man who's retreating because he feels like he's losing control or autonomy, being pursued can actually deepen the withdrawal. It confirms the feeling that he's being monitored, managed, worried over. What tends to work better is something counterintuitive. You reduce the pressure and you increase the invitation. You stop asking, "Are you okay?" and start saying, "I'm going. Fishing Saturday, thought you might want to come." You stop checking in with concern and start just being around without an agenda. You give him a role, ask his opinion on something real. Let the interaction be about something other than him being the subject of your worry. And if he's your father or someone you're genuinely close to, this is the harder part. You may need to gently, carefully open the door yourself, not by confronting his withdrawal, but by modeling vulnerability first. Sharing something real about your own life, giving him permission to be human by being human yourself first. There's another layer to this that I think about a lot, and it has to do with what psychologist Erik Erikson called the final stage of human development, what he called integrity versus despair. In the last chapters of life, the psychological task is essentially to look back and make peace with what you've lived, to find meaning in it, to feel like it mattered. Men who can do that tend to move into older age with a kind of quiet settledness. Men who can't, who look back and see regret they never processed, relationships they never repaired, versions of themselves they never became, often move into despair instead. And despair, particularly in men who've never had an outlet for it, often looks like anger, like bitterness, like withdrawal, not because they hate the people around them, but because being around people is a constant mirror held up to the life they feel like they failed to fully live. This is why you sometimes see a man in his late 60s suddenly becoming difficult, critical, seemingly resentful, when from the outside, his life looks fine. The external life is fine. It's the internal accounting that's devastating him. And the tragedy is, this is exactly the moment when he needs human connection the most. Not to be fixed, not to be analyzed, but to be accompanied, to have someone sit with him in it. So, what do you do if you suspect this is where someone you love is? You don't try to convince him his life was good. You don't give him reasons to be grateful. You ask him questions and you actually listen to the answers. What do you wish had been different? What are you most proud of? You let him tell the full story, including the parts that are complicated, without rushing him toward a tidy resolution. There's one more thing I want to address, because I see this conversation go here sometimes, and I want to be careful about it. Not all withdrawal is a cry for help. Some of it is a genuine, healthy restructuring of a person's social world. There's real psychological research showing that as people age, they naturally prioritize depth over breadth in relationships. They want fewer connections, but more meaningful ones. This is called socio-emotional selectivity theory, and it's a normal, even healthy, part of psychological aging. The difference between healthy pruning and harmful isolation often comes down to a few things. Is he maintaining at least one or two relationships with real depth? Is he still engaging with something, a hobby, a purpose, a creative outlet that gives him energy? Is there a baseline of physical self-care still happening? And perhaps most importantly, does he seem, even in his quietness, to have some sense of internal peace? Or does he seem like a man at war with himself? If it's the former, the kindest thing you can do is respect the restructuring, stay available, and trust that he knows what he needs. If it's the latter, if the withdrawal is shadowed by visible pain, declining self-care, or moments of expressed hopelessness, that's when a gentle, non-pressuring conversation about professional support becomes genuinely important. The deeper truth underneath all of this, the thing I want to leave you with, is that the men who go quiet at 65 or 70 aren't mysteries. They're not broken. They're not cruel. They're often men who were handed an identity, built entirely of function and role and output. And when those things were taken away by time and age, nobody gave them a map for what came next. Society handed them a script that said, provide, protect, produce. And then one day, the curtain came down on that act, and they were standing on an empty stage with no lines, no direction, and an audience of people who still expected the performance to continue. What they needed, what many of them still need, isn't someone to drag them back into the social world. It's someone to sit with them in the quiet and say, you don't have to perform anymore. I'm here for the actual person. That's a sentence most of them have never heard. And for some of them, it might not be too late to hear it. Think about the Gerald at the beginning of this. The man his daughter drove to see. She stood at that door, and he said he needed to be left alone, and she almost left. But she didn't. She asked if she could just sit on his porch for a while. Not talk. Just sit. He said yes. They sat in silence for almost an hour, and then he started talking. Not about the withdrawal, not about what was wrong. He started talking about his own father, who died when Gerald was 14, about something he never got to say, about a version of his life he had always carried quietly. She didn't fix anything. She didn't solve it. She just showed up without an agenda and gave him space to be a full human being. Sometimes that's the entire intervention. If this gave you something to think about, share it with someone who might be navigating this right now, whether they're the one pulling away or the one on the other side of a door that's slowly closing. Understanding the psychology doesn't change people overnight, but it changes how we see them, and sometimes that's where everything starts.